Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. On this episode, I am joined by the designer, community organizer, and youth worker Chris Rudd. Chris is currently a professor of community-driven design at the Illinois Institute of Technology's Institute of Design in Chicago and is the founder of ChiByDesign, a Black-owned and people of color-led human-centered design firm. The Chicago Reader called Chris the anti-capitalist face of design, as his work focuses on creating equity, dismantling racism, and promoting anti-racist design systems. In this episode, I was interested in talking to Chris about what anti-racism in design looks like in practice. We begin this conversation talking about his background as a community organizer and youth worker, and how he was introduced to design in that setting. We talk about his early excitement around things like design thinking, participatory design, and co-design methodologies, and how he grew disenchanted with many of them. And then, of course, we talk about how design promotes racism and what it means to be an anti-racist, post-capitalist designer within these existing power structures. It is a fascinating conversation. The way Chris thinks about these things, I think, is so interesting. And so I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If you like this show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans. They give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface and you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details to sign up and to help support the show. Thank you for listening, and here is my conversation with Chris Rudd. Sort of career trajectory is interesting to me. Your early career and sort of the core of a lot of your work is rooted in community organizing and youth development. And I'm wondering, if to sort of begin and frame the conversation, if you could talk a little bit about how you got into that line of work, a little bit about, kind of what you were interested in when you were a teenager, kind of what kind of things you were doing, and how community organizing became a central part of your life.
Sure. So both my parents were activists in their own rights, and my dad in the labor movement primarily, my mom in community organizing primarily. And so it's a environment, a culture that I grew up in, um, and that I would say I adopted as my own in my teenage years. Um, and so, organizing at school, organizing in the neighborhood around different issues. And then I got into youth development work um, during college. Uh, I took a class on youth development. I didn't know the nonprofit industry was a thing. I thought people just did this organizing because they were supposed to.
Right.
Um, and so then I took that class and introduced me to the nonprofit world. And so then a friend of mine who was working at a place um, asked me to come in and talk with the young people, and that started my path in youth development.
And so can you talk a little bit about what post-college, what were you doing immediately? What kind of work were you involved in with youth development?
Sure. So at that time, it was 2010, I want to say.
Okay.
A kid in Chicago, Darian Albert, had just been murdered uh, by some other young people. He was beat to death. It made national news. It was a big thing. It was really tragic. And so the public school system here decided to start this initiative called Culture of Calm, and a lot of money, a lot of resources to try to help young people who were identified as um, at risk, not just for violence being committed against them, but for them to commit violence.
Mm.
And so they hired an army of folks to um, support these young people. So I started doing that work around violence prevention on the west side of Chicago, and it was a really great experience but it didn't quite fit with my philosophy around violence prevention. That it wasn't just about keeping young people busy. You had to divert their interests and
Mm,
find them an alternative purpose for their
mhm,
lives, right? So um, after the funding for that dried up, I ended up going to work at another organization that was more focused on youth empowerment.
mhm.
And so that's where I got into the juvenile justice world and started focusing on civic tech.
And then is that where the sort of design piece of this came in? Because was it there that you developed this app?
Right.
Was that at that? Okay, could you talk a little bit about that and sort of how this design piece starts to fit to this story?
Sure. So I was still quite unaware of design. I think I had been sent to like one or two trainings. I thought it was interesting. I said, "Oh, okay, this is a cool way to try to solve
Yeah.
issues." And then I was also being introduced to like the civic tech world through
Mm,
this organization called Smart Chicago, a mentor of mine, Dan O'Neill. And so we started working with the county board president around juvenile justice, and so started to develop, or utilizing these new frameworks that I'm learning about with the young people. And so we started using some design tools. We started using participatory action research methods
mm.
to really get the young people to understand the issue and develop their own solutions rather than, the adults trying to say, "Oh, here's the problem that you all are going through.
Right.
Um, let me fix it."
Coming from a background where you were not really aware of design, working in these nonprofits, kind of thinking about youth empowerment, when you started seeing these design methodologies, what what were you thinking? Were you like, "Oh," I mean, you said you're like, "Oh, this is cool, this is interesting." Did you see this as a valuable, as a valuable framework in the work that you were doing? Did it sort of immediately make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, whenever you're dealing with an issue, right? You're trying to figure out the best way to solve it. And so, I started learning some of these design frameworks and methods, and I was like, "Oh, that's a much more creative way of
Okay,
making,
okay.
bullseye, uh, positioning." I was like, "Oh, that's a much better way of thinking about kind of making decisions than just say, oh, put a star next to, this idea."
Got it, yeah.
Especially with young people, right? So like how it was a methodology that really allowed young people's creativity to shine rather than what I felt like at the time was my oldness. And I was still young, but I've been trained in a certain way that
Mhm,
felt really stale.
mhm.
And so design for me felt like a really awesome way to use creativity to help bring out the creativity of the young people to solve the issues that they were working on.
The reason I asked that question, and I'll show my bias here,
Hmm.
is as somebody who is, very deeply in the design world, sometimes when I hear about, uh, things like design for social good or design, for civic engagement, unfortunately, my default is to roll my eyes and think that this is just some sort of like surface level thing that's, vanity project for the designer, or, let's add some like fake creativity to something. And every time I talk to people who don't come from the design world, and they sort of first encounter these things, more often than not, they don't have that sort of negative reaction that I have. And so I'm asking because I'm kind of curious, you know, with your background, do you think you were seeing things? Do you think you saw value in these systems that maybe that trained designers don't even see? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was enamored in the beginning, and now I've,
Yeah, and
I,
we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that too.
for sure. Yeah, I guess I thought about it not as the solution. I thought, it
Right,
was
right,
part of the puzzle.
right.
So, the participatory action research methods not far different. There's some overlap with, just traditional ethnographic research. Like it's a method of ethnographic research,
Hmm.
but that decenters the designer.
Right. Right.
So, I was using it as a way to get my young people who were, some of them have been formerly incarcerated, some had not. I had to get them to care about this population.
Right.
And so, this type of research method made it possible for them to say, "Oh, these are humans who are not bad, right? Things happened. They may have made a decision, but the main thing was that they were caught. It's not that they
Mm.
were drastically different than anyone else. Like
Mhm. Mhm.
as they heard those stories, they said, "Oh shit."
Yeah.
Um, and it's like, yeah, we've all done something that could have ended us, and landed us in a detention center.
Right.
Uh, there's a lot of circumstances that keep many of us out. Um, but the people who get caught aren't necessarily, that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that they're not worth anything.
Can you talk about sort of that early sort of like being enamored with design? Because you then sort of like follow this, you were a civic innovation fellow at the Stanford D School, which is like, uh, sort of best of the best in thinking about design at these types of systems. W-
Mhm.
how did you start to kind of focus on design as one of the major tools that you would use in this work that you were doing?
So I tell people the design world really found me,
Mm,
um, in the sense that uh, I heard about the Stanford D School. I heard about the Civic Innovation Fellowship Program. I said, "Oh man, I really want to do that."
mm,
Um, and then so happened to like meet the director, and he had heard about the app work, and he was like, "We're developing this Civic Innovation Program. Um, we know what we want, and you kind of fit that mold. We would love to support your work, and then have you the way that the fellowship program was kind of built was how do you bring in people doing really cool stuff in the world to help push the D school forward, and the D school can help push those people and their work forward through design." Um, And so, going out there and then really, really actually learning the methods and frameworks. Before that, I was, you know, finding something off the internet, running
right.
running a
Yeah,
thing. It
yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
really handling design properly, and so, that was huge for me to understand what design really is. But then
Mm,
also at the same time, that is where I started to see the limits of it.
right, right.
Um, yeah.
Right. I promise this whole conversation won't be just like going through your background.
Sure.
I do have these kind of bigger questions that I want to ask you, but I'm interested in this sort of trajectory from being working as an organizer, being enamored by design, and then running up against the limits of that. I'm very curious about that
Yeah.
journey. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It's funny when, I was out at the D school, my mom, we were on the phone one time and she goes, "What do you do?"
Right.
Right? Every designer gets that question.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then you try to figure out how do I explain this to them in a way that they'll understand. And so my response was, um, it feels like I'm being trained to work for rich people, to
Mm.
understand poor people, to
Mm-hmm.
make rich people more rich.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so she said, "Why do you want to do that?" And I said, "I don't. I have no interest in doing that.
Yeah.
But I do see value in the way that that design goes about understanding people and trying to meet needs. So,
Mm.
I will absorb all of the knowledge, the methods, frameworks, but I'm not going to embrace the purpose,
Mm.
and which I felt was, to help business. I was
Right.
not gonna become that.
So you were like in this system now at this point. You were at Stanford and you kind of saw what was going on and you're like, I'm gonna stay because I think I can learn these things just so I can then subvert it after.
Mhm.
Right. I love that. So, you know, I think this speaks to this sort of larger sort of evolution of the thinking around things like design thinking, um, which I think your description of working for rich people to help understand poor people so rich people can get richer is like such a great way to kind of describe that, actually. Has now sort of there is a bigger discourse around the problems of design thinking, and people have called it a white supremacy, a sort of rebrand of white supremacy, as sort of this kind of superficial thing of this idea that it preaches decentering the designer while also kind of centering the designer. There's a tweet that I saw a long time ago that somebody said design thinking should be called design thanking, because you're supposed to thank the designer at the end of
Right.
it. And I, I I don't know what my question is there, other than I want to know how you think about how you can use these tools while subverting them at the same time. Can you just talk a little bit more about how you think about both being in the system and also sort of subverting the system at the same time?
I used to think we could just reconfigure the tools and then therefore create drastically different outcomes, right? If I wasn't following the purpose of design thinking, um, then what I was creating was drastically different than what a traditional designer using design thinking methodologies was doing. As I continued to practice, um, I realized that that was no longer true. That the tools, the methods, all those things will always bring us to a particular point.
Mm,
And so design as a field needs new tools to start to move away from the you know what people are saying, like the continuation of white supremacy.
right,
So
right.
so this thing around like anti-racist. If you're not, so I think everything produced in society is racist if it is not actively trying to be anti-racist. So, I think people are getting defensive of this whole thing of like, oh, design thinking or design perpetuates white supremacy. I mean, I don't say it perpetuates white supremacy. I say it perpetuates racism. And that's because if it's not intentionally being anti-racist, the outcome has to be racist.
Let me backtrack for a second, and then I want to come back to this idea. But you, for the last couple of years, have been teaching at the Institute of Design at IIT in Chicago, and teaching, just based on everything we've talked about, makes total sense to me that that you would be teaching, and that seems like a space that makes sense. I'm curious how you bring these ideas into the classroom, and how you bring them into an institution like IIT that has a long history of thinking about design. And I'm not asking you to speak negatively about your employer or anything like that, but can you talk a little bit about um, the response when you say things like this in a classroom?
So interestingly enough, I think, most students feel, my experience is that they believe it. They not just believe it, they understand it.
I totally agree. Do your students come in with a skepticism of design thinking already, do
Lots
you think?
lots of them.
Mm,
Um, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know about
okay.
lots actually. There's a good core that come in with skepticism.
Mm,
There,
okay.
but then there's quite a few that have. Well, what they say is like, I've actually never thought about it like this.
Right, right.
And so, I teach a course called Politics of Design, which is to help, students critically think about design as a process, as a methodology, as a tool, um, but also themselves, that we are not separated from this, right?
Mhm.
Everything about us is embedded in our design process. And so, how do you interrogate? So, when I say politics of design, it's not about who you vote for. I don't care about that. It's about the worldview you have.
Right.
And so, then once you can understand your worldview, then you can start to understand how it is embedded in your process, and sometimes how it should be. So, lots of times, designers are for justice in a lot of ways. They're for the environment, right? We have these things we care about because we're people, But then, so then there's another activity where I have them start to dissect where power lies in the design process or in a design
Mm,
process.
mm-hmm.
And so they have to understand where they actually can control things and where they can't. And
Oh,
then
interesting.
who does control it,
Right.
right? So, we can think about I think the tension I had initially coming to ID was I think many of my colleagues still held the notion that design was neutral,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, so that's been a debate, which has been healthy and good. I think more people are starting to understand
Yeah.
that it's not. And so I think that was a tension for me when I first arrived. Plus, the history of ideas still is very much focused on business
Right.
and how can design serve at the pleasure of business. And that was not my intent. And so I definitely was like, where do I fit in here?
Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah,
I want to go back to that thing you said about the activity you do where you have your students sort of interrogate power or figure out where power is, where the power lies in the design process, because that was something I was thinking about as I was preparing for this conversation and thinking about you and thinking about the things you've talked about. When I talk about these ideas with my own students, um, they're very much like your students. It sounds like. I mean, they if they haven't thought about it, they are energized by these conversations. A lot of them are aware of design not being neutral, aware of how their ideologies. It's something they get these ideas
mm,
very quickly. They're progressive. They want to care about the environment and dismantling capitalism. These are all things that they get excited about, and then when it comes to their work, they feel so powerless.
mhm.
um like, yes, I'm in all these ideas, but I'm like one cog in this. I'm just a designer. And can you talk a little bit about sort of the levels of power and how you kind of think about that and the outcomes of when your students do this, of sort of at different levels of the design process, how you can start to inject um you know levels of change, whether that's anti-racism, anti-capitalism, whatever.
Sure. So, I think the main revelation that they have when they finish the assignment. So we actually did it last week,
Mm.
and that we had our critique and everyone was sharing. And the main thing that students always see is as much as these processes say that they are human centered, user centered,
Yeah.
right? When
Yeah.
you diagram it, that is the one group that is always missing each and every time. And so, I tell them, I said, the purpose of the diagram is to show you what is there, but it also shows you what's not.
Hmm.
And so they're always like, that's so crazy. It's like,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah.
um, but then they start to see the thing that I tell them is that um, when we think about power, I think people tend to think about it as this kind of abstract thing that exists outside of any control.
Mm.
That you either have it or you don't, and that's just the way it is in that dynamic. But um, what I have them do is start to map out what gives them power in each point of the process, right? Whoever has power, you tell me, and then what are the mechanisms that enable them to have that power? And that's where we as designers have control.
Right.
Can we start to redesign those mechanisms in a way that distributes power?
So can you talk about this specifically in something like code design, which I've heard you talk about before, and you described it as manipulative and that you want to like move past this idea of code design, which I, agree with 100%. And I think I think a lot of these things about talking about like code design or participatory design, they do have this sort of uh veneer of human centeredness. But then it's interesting to hear that your students sort of reveal this in these diagrams. How how does this change the position of the designer to truly do collaborative design, for example? um, both using their power but also distributing power to others at the same time. How do you kind of think about that, or how does that sort of play into practice?
Yeah, so I think, co-design is the best approach we have right now to redistribute power. The the main critique is, I think, a lot of traditional co-design is about just a workshop here and there, which is
Yeah,
really like a feedback loop, right?
right.
We created this thing. What do you think? Oh, you want to add a feature to it? Cool. Um, but the essence of the thing is what we created, which is in the interest of the client. Um, and so, I also run a firm called ChiByDesign where I always say we practice radical co-design, which part of the model is we hire the end users to join the team from the very beginning.
Mm,
And so they're no longer touch points along the process. They are strictly embedded, deeply embedded throughout the project. And then, so then it's how you give them more power really around decision making. So, I try to teach this at ID as well as, um, with the co-design class that I teach, we try to do projects in that way so they can start to understand, um, you know, the PowerPoints that designers have, right? Which are typically they're lent to us from the client. Um, and so how do we take that power and then give it to the co-designers? And so that can come in the form of, creating the interview protocol, synthesis, the recommendation, the concept, right? Giving them the power to develop those and have the final say. It's not to say that we're not involved, um, because I think I hear it from our co-designers all the time that this is a new thing that they're learning and they find value in it. So that facilitator piece comes into play. I think it's also a good tool for us or for the field to try to diversify. Um, so when we hire these folks, at least 50% after each project say they want to go into design.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and so, and these are young folks of color. These are uh, typically young folks of color that we hire. We have one parent. We're doing a project in Ohio in the foster care system, and so we have a, a parent on as a co-designer who's also a social worker, and so he's like, "Oh man, every social worker needs to learn this now." I want,
Hmm.
he's trying to help his colleagues understand design, but not taking away from them being social workers, but that it's an extra tool in their tool belt to help their clients. So it really becomes a powerful way, not just to share power, but to diversify the field.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up Shy by Design because I wanted to talk to you about that. And so I have two questions about that. Firstly, I'll ask these to you at the same time and you can kind of answer them how you want. But can you talk a little bit more specifically about the types of projects you're working on with the studio, what type of systems you're working within, what you're kind of being asked to design? But then the second part is I'm wondering if you talk a little bit more about this idea of sort of inviting everybody in as a co-designer is really interesting to me in that um it almost changes the definition of who the designer is. This
Hmm.
border between designer and client or designer and public starts to dissolve, it sounds like, in this process. Can you talk about that a little bit more as well?
In Shop by Design, we've essentially only worked with like social service organizations, philanthropies, and so we're starting to get into government more. Last year, we worked on a project to rethink what community safety looks like in Chicago.
Mm,
We worked on a project to develop a framework on equitable resource allocation in Chicago. We started this project with Ohio around eliminating racism within the foster care system. Uh, Worked on a project to help develop an equitable food system here in the Chicagoland with just really great partners who are interested and want to figure out how do you become anti-racist.
Right.
And so our work really is focused at the systems level, that if you're going to do anti-racist work, and so this is the main thing, like design thinking can't do it. Design
Right.
thinking, right?
Right.
It's point solutions for a challenge. And so what I always tell people, it's good to help you navigate, because it's only at the experience level, right? So it's good to help you navigate the horrible situation, the racist, oppressive situation you're in, but it cannot change the situation, right? It cannot change the
Mm.
context.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is, so our work is always at the systems level. Obviously, there's, experience considerations within that, but what are the new organizations? What are the new policies that need to exist to enable anti-racist outcomes? Um, so yes, clients come to us saying, "Oh, they think that it's something very simple that they want."
Right. Always. Yeah, of
Right.
course.
But then, like the point is, like, you're trying to change structural racism. That's never going to be simple or easy. And then the thing that they learn is that they can't do it by themselves.
Mm.
They then have to become a conduit in the system, whatever ecosystem they're in, for that bigger change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always interesting. And then when we bring in, the co-designers, the people who are affected personally by the system that the client has created, one, it gives us a whole new level of understanding, right?
Right.
You do
Yeah.
an interview for an hour, that information you're getting is already contained because of the questions you've crafted,
Right. Right.
right? There's
Yep.
no those. So then, we understand that limit, but then when you bring in the co-designer, even the limits of the question, the protocol grow, because they say, well, actually, you should probably ask about this, or we should talk about this. Um, then when you're in the interview and they're there, they get a level of trust that no designer ever can. I've been doing this for a while now. I feel like interviewing is probably my strongest suit,
Mhm.
and no way I could get the information that these folks get, because I don't have the experience to share with the people that we're interviewing.
Right.
Then when synthesis comes, right, they understand what they're saying in a way that I just can never get either. Um, so it definitely changes the power dynamic. It changes the outcome, um, because it's just so much better.
I have a question that I'm not totally sure how to ask, to be honest. Because I understand what you're saying about sort of the system level, and if you're going to tackle anti-racism in design or produce anti-racist design, that there's all these kind of levels that you have to, kind of hit. And I teach primarily graphic designers. Every now and then I'll have like an industrial designer in a class, but it's mostly graphic designers. So they're dealing with apps and websites and signage and branding,
Mhm,
and often the way sort of design is talked about in those contexts are, you make something more inclusive by having photos that show a diversity of people,
mhm,
whether that's race, age, ability, that sort of thing, or it's kind of being aware of cultural differences. What do colors represent for different culture? What's that like? What language are you using? That sort of thing. And all of those are good. I don't mean to say that those are not good things, but those are also very kind of surface level. And I'm curious if you can talk about how, what what you think anti-racist design looks like. I don't mean looks like aesthetically, but
mhm.
how do you kind of see that living in the world, especially for somebody like a graphic designer who's often working at a sort of higher systems level than sort of deep cultural, entrenchment systems level. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think all those things are important, but the so then the next piece is, where are they placed? I think a lot of organizations think the diverse representation should be placed where the diversity is. And so then therefore you already see diversity really means black and brown, right?
Mm.
It's not even
Mhm.
about diversity. It's really about the segregation.
Mm.
Uh, so, we need more pictures of happy black families, or we need more pictures of happy brown families, uh, to put in our locations that serve those populations, right?
Mm. Mhm.
So, one thing I told you, we know that we're happy. I don't need to see a picture of that. I have family photos to prove that. The people who need to see that are the folks who don't know that that's true.
Right, that's what I was gonna say, or it's to go for the white people to see so they can feel good about it, or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, it's good that you have that, but don't just put it in places where people already know that that's true, right? How are
Right.
you flooding other communities with those images? I think your point is spot on, that it's never just going to be imagery. It has to be a collection of things, right?
Mhm.
Um, so are you putting black businesses also in those locations, right? So I think designers have to ask bigger questions. Also, have to start saying no to things, right? So even though Shy by Design is doing well, we also say no.
Right.
Um, like if we don't think a project can have an anti-racist outcome, we won't touch it. If we don't think the client is necessarily, committed to this, we won't do it. So we'll say no. And so, I think that's something that, especially big firms, I don't think they have a practice of doing yet,
Yeah, yeah.
but it needs to happen. Like we're not gonna get change if we're just staying at the service level, right? So even if we're a graphic design um, focus firm, understanding that it's not just about that piece.
It's really easy and it's true to say that, and maybe this goes back to kind of that earlier comment I made about how when I hear about like design for social good, my immediate reaction is to roll my eyes, is because there's this sort of like hubris that comes with thinking that design can solve a problem that in many ways is also caused by design, like another type of design. And so you
Hmm.
can you can see it in like very obvious ways, the development of cities that are designed in a way to encourage segregation, or um, I had Deanna Van Buren on the show a couple years ago, who's a an architect and kind of prison reform activist,
Mm.
and she talked about like sort of the Jeffersonian style of architecture that on one hand to some groups of people represents like history and seriousness, and to other groups of people represent oppression. And so there's like these aesthetics of buildings and the way buildings can kind of encourage subtly a type of racism or segregation. But what I'm hearing, what is interesting about what I'm hearing you saying is that, yeah, those are all like easy to identify, but there's all these other sort of subtle forms of design, whether that's who has a seat at the table, who is involved in the design process, where the design is placed, that are maybe less obvious, that are also uh, kind of contributing to these ideas, which goes back to like what you said earlier, where it's like if you're not being actively anti-racist, uh, if your design is not actively anti-racist, then it is racist.
I think I think the architecture world has definitely been leading in
Hmm.
terms of like identifying and calling out racism within their process and their outcomes, and even taking steps to say they're not going to build prisons anymore.
Right, right,
You know,
right.
I haven't seen that come from other design, traditions
Mm,
and subfields. So, I don't think it's necessarily easy. I
yeah,
think I was very, inspired to see that. But I think they also understand that it's the built environment that then affects the lived environment. And so all of these other fields, right? The visuals, the business development, uh, the service, all these different subsets of design now have to go through the same thing. how have we contributed to this so that that way we can start to collectively move away from it, or not just move away from it, oppose it, actively
Right.
oppose it,
Right.
um, which will take all of us. It can't just be one subset that says, we're taking a stand. We all have to do it in a particular way.
You mentioned earlier that when you started at ID, a lot of the kind of school was still really focused on business and how design can kind of serve business. And we've been talking about your work and kind of talking about a lot of these ideas, not always in a business context. And I'm wondering if that's how you see that applying within a sort of kind of capitalist system in a business context. Um, does that require different approaches, or do your students kind of go back into industry, or how do you kind of see that relationship within a lot of these ideas?
I think, ideas becoming more focused on um, social impact, to be honest. Like, more, lots of my colleagues, have interests that lie beyond making
Mhm, mhm,
businesses more money, um, which is nice. Like, there's been I think, a healthy progression and evolution that idea over the past couple of years, um, and now we're figuring out how to do that together, which I think is really awesome. Like, right now, co-teaching a class with two other brilliant professors, Carlos Teixeira and Ruth Schmidt, and we're working on redesigning the find and feed kind of system
mm,
here in Chicago. And so Carlos has, advanced expertise in systems design and systems thinking. Ruth is, at the forefront of the field around behavioral design. And then I come with the anti-racist perspective. And so, it's it's awesome to see what the students are already coming up with. We're just in round one of prototyping, and so they're trying to figure out how to con- embed concepts around
mm,
sustainability, equity, um, that then encourages anti-racist
right.
behavior, and all these other things, but also uh, gets the system to change. So, again, not just having point solutions. Um, so, I think as a school, we're figuring out quickly now how to collaboratively move forward a more impactful agenda. There's still pieces that say, okay, a business could make money off of this. Okay, we're not going to get past that right now. We're in capitalism, so that's the other thing I tell students. I don't agree that design ruined the world, but I also don't agree that it'll
Yes.
save the world.
Yeah.
Um, right. So, you know, we have to work within the paradigm that we're in, but how do we also use our talents to support the change that will have to come from the broader population? And so, can we create features in technology or in services or in objects that enable society to act more
Mm.
anti-racist? And so that's what I push my students to think about and create. Yeah, can we design for post-capitalism? I don't think so, but I think we can design ways in which to help us get past capitalism.
I love that. Let me ask you the last question that I use to end all of these interviews. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
I feel like I buy so many books now.
Yeah,
Um,
you and me both.
yeah, people are just out here writing good stuff. But I feel like I keep going back to particular readings over and over. Um, So, a couple great books. Fatal Invention by
Mm,
Dorothy Roberts. It's about, it's called How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the
mm,
21st Century. Um, Race After Technology. I always come back to that. Ruha Benjamin. Um, and then the one that I'm starting new is The Sum of Us, which is all about how racism affects all of society, not just folks of color. And I think that's a critical piece that we all have to understand. Right? As long as there's racism inequality for people of color, white people are not going to live the lives that they could,
Right.
for lots of
Right.
reasons. So, yeah, we get it worse, but that means you're not getting what you should
Right.
either. Hence the opioid epidemic, right? Like,
Well, that's a good way to to wrap this up.
I feel like all my interviews wrap up on a positive note, right? Opioid epidemic, boom. And
Yeah,
we'll
I
see
don't
you
know. I
next
don't know
time.
what else to say now. Chris, I think you're doing important work. I am a fan, and it was really great to kind of talk to you about all these ideas. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
This episode was recorded on February 4th, 2022. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Service Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.